Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity for speaking today. Basically, as Courtney mentioned, I'm going to be talking a bit about climate change and mining, the vital role of the minerals industry in the transition to a low carbon dioxide future is how I've titled this talk. I'm going to start off by being kind of deliberately provocative and saying that mining is old, dirty, problematic, and we don't need it anymore. I mean, nobody in the room or online actually believes that, and I'll explain, or reiterate, as you all know, why mining is vital to modern society. But this is kind of one of the challenges that we're facing as a minerals community, as the minerals industry, as academics who work in the minerals industry, is that, even in places that are familiar with mining, even here in the state of Nevada, which is the US's biggest gold producer, we can run into this thing that nobody does mining anymore, nobody needs mining anymore, so why are we actually bothering? This is obviously untrue, and this is something that we're going to have to fight against, especially there's increasing demands for metals are going to occur as a result of what we're seeing in terms of transitioning to this low or zero carbon dioxide future. So you all know the previous statement is incorrect. Mining has been vital to modern life and society for centuries. It's going to remain so for the foreseeable future. It's needed to kind of meet things such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals and much, much more. But not many people think about that, especially outside of mining. Even in countries like Australia, which is obviously a large mining and minerals industry, states like Nevada or Colorado with lots of active mining. This is why we're getting protests at mining conferences globally, and the unwillingness of banks and other organizations to deal with anybody who's interested in or active in the kind of mining sector. People claim things like, or say things like mining is dirty, harms the environment and people. Perhaps that's true. Certainly in the past, there have been a number of incidences in those areas. But the minerals industry certainly does a better job of environmental assessment, claimed, etc. in the past. They're having to be much more socially aware. Environmental, social, and governmental risks are among the big challenges facing the minerals industry. And we know that mining can provide communities with benefits. But a lot of this gets lost in translation. A lot of this kind of doesn't get understood or thought of by people. More importantly, perhaps meaningful climate change mitigation and limiting carbon dioxide emissions is going to require even more mining than we do at the minute. I'll go through the data to back up this claim shortly, but before I do that, I just want to kind of go through a brief reminder of why modern society needs mining and some of the kind of large-scale trends we're seeing in the minerals industry in terms of metal demand and supply. This is what every American born needs. This is the 2020 version produced by the Minerals Education Coalition. For anybody who uses metric, I've done the metric conversions here. But this is the per capita consumption of minerals and things like petroleum and gas for the US essentially. So you're talking about 2,500 pounds of bauxite, 11,500 pounds of clays, 21,000 pounds of iron ore, 500 pounds of zinc. This is something that we all have an idea about, but something that the general public doesn't understand or doesn't kind of grasp in terms of the importance of the minerals industry to their way of life, to modern society, the modern way of living. Well, you know that modern technologies have become more mineral intensive. On the left here, we have a 1980s unsmartphone and the range of elements that are typically contained in these, the technology back, say, 30, 40 years ago. On the right, we have a modern day smartphone device. You can see the range of elements we use in typical modern technology has just expanded a huge amount. We've doubled the amount of elements we use in these in modern technology. We've removed very little, maybe removed some beryllium, removed some lead, but we've just added a whole range of other elements. And these elements impart to these technologies the things we consider standard. Touchscreen capabilities, the abilities to have color screens, the abilities to have something that will fit in your pocket rather than something that needs something vastly different to carry about, like the phone on the left, increased battery life, and so on. All the things we consider routine have been basically caught or enabled by the fact that we use much more of the periodic table than we did 30 or 40 years ago. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'm happy to share this presentation with anybody who's interested, but just to highlight some of the things that we consider routine, like a touch screen. The touchscreen technology on your laptops or your smartphones is enabled by a very thin indium tin oxygen compound that's actually that enables your screen to be conductive. The way we use these elements in these smartphones and your laptops and things also means that these elements are inherently unrecyclable. To recycle that indium tin and the indium tin oxide, you'd have to essentially scrape off a tiny layer from each of the smartphones or laptops that get recycled. That's something that we haven't got around to yet, or haven't developed how the means or know how to do that economically. So a lot of these elements we're incorporating into modern technologies are becoming one use. Recycle less than 1% of the rare earths, less than 1% of indium, and all sorts of other elements. We are increasingly demanding more of in the minerals industry. Similarly, if we think about kind of greener technology, renewable energy generation, and so on, if we look at a 3 megawatt turbine, these are kind of approximate numbers, but you're talking about 3 tons of aluminum or aluminium for any Brits out there in the audience. Maybe 2 tons of rare earth elements for the actual kind of energy, magnets involved in the generation of energy, electricity, and so on. 4.7 tons of copper to get that electricity somewhere. A lot of steel, a lot of concrete, some zinc, some molybdenum, and so on. So if we're talking about the large scale replacement of fossil fuel energy generation with things like this, we're going to need to have a huge amount of more infrastructure to actually enable this to happen. And all of that requires much more in the way of minerals, in the way of metals, and so on. So that's just a few examples of how the things we take for granted as parts of modern life require minerals and metals. We know that minerals and metals are the material basis for modern society. We know that's why we need mining. That's a message that needs to get out further than just the people listening in this audience, and it's something that we need to somehow translate to the general public because they're the ones who need to know how vital mining is to modern life. And all of this, combined with increases in population, is the reason we currently mine more minerals and metals than any other time in human history. It's an underlying trend for the last century plus, and that trend isn't going away. I've got a few graphs just to show that here. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Again, if anybody's interested in the publications kind of underlying these data and these trends, I'm happy to share them. Just send me an email sometime after this presentation. So this is just gold from about 1913 to about 2015 or so, and the trend has continued here. Annual gold production back in 1913 was about 700 tons per year. Nowadays, we're talking 3,000 tons per year or thereabouts. You can obviously see the rise of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, Australia taking over here, China becoming increasingly important. West African production is significant as well. And then we get the rest of the world, lots of gold mining occurring globally. It's not just gold. This is copper. Again, copper up to about 2015. Again, you're going from a base level of way less than 1 million tons per year to north of 20 million tons of copper per year, with some estimates suggesting we might need to double that in the next 20 or 30 years or so to meet to essentially meet this continuing trend of increased demand. And this graph just shows total demand, and this chart is proportional by a country of production. Show that there's the rise of Chile, the dominance of the US for a significant part of copper production throughout the 1800s, 1900s, and so on. Similar to zinc, again, exactly the same story. 1840, we've got a very low annual zinc production through the 1930s, 1940s. Around the 1960s, things suddenly rapidly start to accelerate. And again, we're kind of north of 14, 15 million tons a year plus zinc production now. This is what we see in almost every metal, almost every mineral commodity you can think of. These underlying trends are what we're seeing. It just shows how important the minerals industry is to modern society. The fact that not only we're recycling more of these metals, but the underlying, the demand is such that we need to mine more and more to satisfy what modern society requires. And this applies to almost all metals. This is USGS data, normalized 1956. So essentially, if we're producing the same amount of a commodity in the present day as we did in 1956, everything would be along this line here. It's a logarithmic graph. You can see something like the rare earth elements were producing more than 10, maybe 20 times the amount of rare earth elements we produced in the 1950s. Almost all of the commodities shown here, bauxite, copper, lead, the platinum group elements, all of them have increased over time. We also are recycling much more of these elements. These are just a selection of elements. You can pick a range of elements or a range of metals and minerals, and you'll see almost exactly the same thing. The important thing is that it's not just totals. So if I look on the next graph, this is normalizing for population increase. So this is the per capita production of metals, or if you like, per capita consumption of metals from 1956 to the present day. All the metals and minerals shown on here have increased with the exception of lead, tin, and tungsten. These metals have increased in terms of total production since 1956 for sure, but they haven't. Their per capita production hasn't increased more than this 1956 level. So we use less lead, less tin, and less tungsten per head of population than we did in 1956. But everything else you see here, we're using 10 times more rare earth elements per person per year today than we did in 1956. And that's just an advent of modern society and the modern way of living. We mine more. One question is, okay, does that mean we're running out? We're reaching peak minerals or anything like that? If you look at the data here on the right, this is from a paper himself, Gavin Mudd and John Thompson had out a couple of years ago, just looking at USGS, essentially USGS reserves and production ratios. What you can see is the numbers aren't hugely important. These reserve production ratios on years left in terms of reserves have actually kind of come down and you reach almost steady baseline to the last 30 years or so in the vast majority of commodities. In other words, there's some volatility in here that may represent poor data or natural volatility in the production of these commodities. But what we're seeing here is essentially these flatlining trends for copper, lead, nickel, tin, zinc, vanadium, all sorts of different commodities. Is essentially what we're doing is we're mining out reserves that are known and replenish them by the delineation of known but not formally quantified mineralization. In other words, we're converting resources to reserves at a rate that's more than equaling the increased production we're seeing in all of these commodities. We can have a look at that in a bit more detail if we just look at copper. These are copper data for 2015 and 2010. Ignore the slight spelling mistake here, but what we've got is we've got 2010 mineral resources, copper mineral resources globally. We actually compensated for cumulative production, so we're actually taking production into account here. These are 2015 mineral resources. What you can see is if everything remained the same, in other words, if you mined out if your resources had been, your resource replenishment and your production had actually been completely replaced by the addition of new resources, everything would plot along a one-to-one line. What we can see is actually everything is slightly, the y equals 1.13x. In other words, on average, global copper resources between 2010 and 2015 increased by 13% despite and compensating and incorporating increased production. That excludes new discoveries as well. So, all of this indicates that essentially that reserves are generally steady, resources are increasing through brownfield expansion, we're adding new discoveries, adding more metal to the mix. So in other words, what we have is almost like a steady state in the minerals industry over the kind of 5 or 10 year time scale. So in other words, you could take this as at face value and say, oh, it's all good. We're not running out at all. We're doing pretty well in terms of discovery, in terms of brownfield expansion, in terms of replacing resources with, reserves with upgraded resources, and we're actually delineating new resources as well. So we're kind of all good. It's not exactly that simple, because what we're seeing at the minute and what we're going to see over the next 20, 30, 40 years is a significant change in demand for the minerals industry. That's what the predictions are showing, and that's what I'll talk about for the next few slides. So To get all the solar panels, all the wind turbines, all the geothermal or whatever energy you need to essentially low and zero carbon dioxide energy, you need to replace fossil fuels in our energy generation mix, the energy storage we need, the infrastructure and things like electric vehicles. Basically, if we have any hope of meeting carbon dioxide emissions targets, we're going to need even more mining than we do already. We already mine and recycle more than ever. People talk about the International Energy Agency's 2-degree temperature increase target. That puts a limit on 2015 to 2100 carbon dioxide emissions to about 1,000 gigatons. If we carried on at the present rate, we'd be emitting nearly triple that in between 2015 and 2100. The targets that are being set mean that we need carbon dioxide emissions to decrease by 60% by 2050 and to decline to neutrality shortly thereafter. In other words, we need to rapidly roll out renewables, low and zero carbon dioxide transport, energy storage on a grid scale, and so on. Some of you in the audience might, and I'll talk about this in the slides shortly, some of you in the audience might kind of not think that climate change that we're seeing is important or is anthropogenic in any way. But the fact is that what we're seeing is consumer demand trends. You know, the increased consumer demand for electric vehicles, renewable energy makes this metal and mineral demand increase probably inevitable. You know, if we look at electric vehicles, for example, they require more metals than petrol vehicles, gas vehicles, and there's no point powering an electric vehicle with electricity generated at a coal-fired power station. It's worse than a petrol-less or gas SUV. So, you know, these are things that people need to think about when they're talking about if they're going to make policy in these areas, what actually the policy means and what the implications are of the things they're deciding. So if you don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, hopefully that doesn't apply to anyone here, but it does apply to some people in society. Either way, to be blunt, it doesn't matter. Why? Firstly, the science doesn't really care what you believe in, and also politicians have a habit of talking about one thing and doing another. So even though we've had people denying kind of climate change or dismissing it, it's why the, for example, Department of Defense in 2019 and 2020 has put out reports relating to how they're mitigating against climate change. You know, it doesn't matter what politicians say, that the government, the armed forces are doing things about, and the energy generation sector are doing things in this area already because they're pretty sure it's happening. The other big trend is we're already shifting this way anyway. You know, we're shifting to low carbon dioxide energy generation and transport. It's a global movement. It's a global trend. It's going to continue. It's being driven by consumer sentiment and investment funding. And those are two pretty powerful forces if you're dealing with any type of business. And the other thing to consider is things like metal mining, mineral processing, green technology, energy development. All of this involves the production of high value raw materials. There's the potential to generate a lot of well-paid jobs, as we saw during the late 2000s mining boom in places like Australia, certainly over here in the US and so on. The question is, you know, do you want to get on board with this and enjoy the benefits of that boom, although there's going to be some challenges along the road as well, or do you want to leave other countries and other people to actually enjoy the benefits? And that's one question that I think we need to all consider when we're thinking about these changes in demand that we're going to be seeing and are seeing already in the minerals industry. If we ever think about cars as a starting point, this is just some copper data. We have an internal combustion engine car. At the top here, contains about 48 pounds of copper. A hybrid electric vehicle contains about 88 pounds of copper, so kind of double. Battery electric vehicle contains nearly 4 times as much copper as an internal combustion engine vehicle. EVs are also heavier. That means that they're kind of less efficient, although they require more energy and so on. So there's other things to consider in terms of what we're facing with this transition to electric vehicles. And there's an article on news today talking about how electric vehicle demand is just increasing and increasing. So as again, these trends are happening. We're seeing them happen, and you know, they're not going away anytime soon. If we think about copper, you know, global vehicle production at the moment uses about 1 million tons of copper per year. Or what is it, about, let's say, 5% of global copper production. 1% of those new vehicles are currently electric. There's been stated aims of various countries, various companies to move to all electric vehicle fleets by about 2035, 2050, something like this. If we say, okay, well, those targets are great, but let's be a bit more realistic. Let's say the world goes all electric vehicles, or as many as they can by about 2060. Electric vehicles, as we've seen previously, We need 4 times as much copper as a gas vehicle. If we go all electric, that means the global car industry is going to need about 4 million tons of copper production a year, assuming no new growth in new vehicle demand, which is not going to happen. People all over the world want more cars. There's been increasing amounts of car demand going on year, and that's a trend that's not going to go away either. It's a 400% increase from what we see now in terms of demand from the car sector. It's 20% of global copper production or thereabouts at the minute. The only thing, it's more. You need infrastructure to charge these electric vehicles. You need renewable energy sources. This is just transport, and this is just copper. I mean, if we think of all the other metals that go into these vehicles that don't go into gas vehicles, then all of a sudden we start to realize what sort of demand we're facing in terms of the primary demand for metals from these sectors and the various other sectors. If we think about energy generation, so this is looking at the lithium-ion battery packs in passenger electric vehicles. Here we are now in 2022. We're talking maybe 2 million tons of materials going into passenger electric vehicles at the minute. If we think 8 years down the track, we're talking about quadrupling that demand. So all the copper, all the aluminum, graphite, nickel, cobalt, lithium, manganese, all these things that are going into electric vehicle battery electric vehicle batteries. We're thinking about that demand for these is going to increase fourfold from what they are now to 2030, and then continue increasing, most likely. Again, this is just electric vehicles. If we look at World Bank predictions, this is what the World Bank is saying is going to happen in terms of energy technology demand. This is just energy technology. This isn't all the infrastructure. This isn't like things like electric vehicle charging stations and things like that. This is just energy technologies. If we look at the left, what we have there is a graph of 2050 annual demand as a percentage of 2018 production. And on the right, we're looking at annual demand from energy technologies in 2050. The graph on the left is probably the most informative, because what you're seeing is increases in 450 to 500% increases in demand for graphite, lithium, and cobalt. More than 200% increase in demand for indium, 200% increase in demand for vanadium, doubling the amount of global nickel production, increasing by 50% global silver production, then neodymium, lead, and so on. There's a huge range of metals here that we're going to see significant increases in demand for as a result of the transition that we're seeing in energy technology and energy generation. We can put that in more meaningful statistics, if you like. Here's our 2018 annual production in thousands of tons. Here's our 2050 projected annual demand from energy technology and energy technology alone. And here are those percentage values. So again, copper, talking 7% increase, so about 1.3 million tons. But again, this is just energy technologies alone. It doesn't incorporate all that infrastructure, all those electric vehicles, and anything like that. So this is kind of like the minimum increase we'll see if the world keeps on going along current trends. 100% increase in global nickel production is a challenge. It's an opportunity for sure, but actually thinking about where we're going to get that from and how quickly we're going to have to get it. 2050 is only 28 years away now. So how many nickel projects are we going to need to bring on stream to produce all of this nickel, and how much, 460% increase in demand for cobalt? That's a completely different question given the co- and byproduct nature of that metal. So World Bank estimates indicate that we're going to need about 3 billion tons of minerals and metals to deploy wind, solar, geothermal power, transition to electric vehicles, energy storage, and all of this if we're going to hit meaningful climate change targets. And remember, it's not just about hitting climate change targets, it's about consumer demand and consumer and investment sentiment. We're going to need mining. We're going to need lots of mining, but it's not the only thing. It's not easy, as you guys probably know better than I do, that it's not easy to ramp up production of any metal, like copper and nickel. There's also a range of other interesting metals in there, like neodymium, lithium. The question is, where do we get these from? There's a whole range of metals like this that are called the critical metals that I'm all sure you've heard lots and lots about. It could be even more problematic for a low carbon dioxide future. It could be even more problematic given the demand trends we're seeing, but we need to think about where we're going to get these from in the not too distant future. If we look at the critical minerals here in the US, this is the 18th May 2018 US Department of the Interior list. I'm not going to go into it in detail. This just gives you an idea of the elements that the US considers critical. This has changed somewhat. There's a draft list released, I believe, at the end of last year for public comment, and that's still open for public comment at the minute. Basically, the list here, it gives you an idea of the metals we consider critical in terms of security of supply and in terms of critical for things like energy generation and so on. What are the critical metals and why should we care? There's no strict definition or global agreement on what elements are critical, but in general, they're like indium. They provide essential properties to a technology or product. This is especially true of low carbon dioxide technologies, electric vehicles, etc., vital for climate change mitigation. They're not easily substituted or recycled. You can't just swap one rare earth element in for another or just swap one metal in for another. Recycling is a problem here. We can't meet increasing demand by recycling what we're using already because of the trends I showed in a few slides earlier. They're subject to supply chain risk, and they're often strategic, geopolitically, talking military, energy production, and so on. And a few of these elements are produced as main products by mining. They're often dominated by extraction at smelters or refineries as byproducts, and uncertain what values accrue to the source mine. And this is something that we're kind of thinking about with some of these metals and materials flows and where they're actually produced from in the first place. What this does mean is that we have unrealized potential, significant unrealized potential for critical metal production. Here in the US, globally, we know that these metals often deport to waste rather than being produced as a result of economics, mineral processing approaches, and quite often insufficient knowledge of deportment, where these metals sit within ore bodies. And resources are also reported. Numerous mines produce these metals, but they don't state them as reserve resource reporting because of constraints of that kind of, the JORC code and so on that actually restrict what you can report in terms of the metals that may be extracted, but actually don't, form greater than, say, 5–10% of the value in an ore body. If we look at critical metals, so these are metals that are generally considered critical. Everything in red here on the left here, this is what's called a companionality diagram. So we have our main products here in the middle and our co and byproducts surrounding them. And the closer the metal is to the middle, the more we're reliant on production of that main product to actually get the byproducts out that we consider to be critical. So selenium and tellurium, they're both considered critical. They're both byproducts of the copper industry. Cadmium, indium, and germanium, both byproducts of zinc. We can illustrate that slightly differently on the right. Here we have our main or co-product metals. So these are the things we actually actively mine for in the main. Here's our core byproduct metals, and here's what we consider completely byproducts. So any of these metals that we consider critical are reliant on the production of a main metal for us to actually get them out of the ground and use them in modern technology. We can put it more simply. The table at the bottom here, this is work by Tom Gradle that basically stood up over the last 6 or 7 years. So if we're looking at copper, if we want any cobalt, if you want things like certainly tellurium, selenium, all of these are essentially functions of copper production. Similarly, indium and germanium and cadmium, if you want any of these metals, you need to mine zinc and extract them as a byproduct. One thing here is this shows kind of how some of the supply chains of these critical metals are very much reliant on sectors of the minerals industry. If zinc demand and production drop for some reason, we lose production of indium, germanium, and cadmium, limit production of touchscreens, LEDs, fiber optic cables, semiconductors, and so on. And things like cadmium telluride solar panels. All of these things would be impacted by not a change in the production of these byproducts, but a change in the production of the main products that these byproducts are reliant on. We can look at that in a kind of graphical form. So these are global production of critical metals. These bars up here, this color, they're all relatively small compared to copper, and that's one of the issues in that these things aren't big enough to form a sector of the minerals industry by themselves in a main. They can't undergo transformational change. The other columns here show the reliance of these metals on the production of something else, some other metal. They're all the proportion of these that are produced as byproducts of something else. Two other things to note here. We don't know how much of these metals are produced as byproducts of other metals. We just don't have the data, so these are uncertainties. We don't have production data for some other metals. So even though we're considering these metals critical, we don't actually know how much we produce or what they're produced as a byproduct of in some cases. So again, we have significant knowledge gaps in these areas that we need to fill before we start actually kind of addressing the problems. What do we know about critical metal resources? There's a few of them that have been well quantified. The platinum group elements, the rare earth elements, indium in some ways. But a lot of critical metal resources have uncertainties, little to no data available for resources or reserves. Sometimes even production we don't have a good handle on, or there's contrasting data from, say, the US and British geological surveys. If you actually compare some of the production data that these geological surveys produce and publish, they can often conflict and contrast with each other, which creates a lot of uncertainty. One couple of questions: how can we assess the criticality of a metal or focus on security of supply without knowing where these metals are coming from and how much we have in the ground already and how much is being produced and is in supply chains already that could be targeted and extracted? And how can we produce more of these metals and ensure their supply, given the fact that they're buying co-products? And these are all questions we need to think about, not just in terms of how we produce more metals, but how we make the most of the ore bodies we have already in production or that will come into production in the near future. So there's a few things we need to know. We need to know baselines on how we can meet future demand. We can't rely on published resource reserve data because the resource and reserve reporting codes mean that you can't often report these critical metals. The Sierra Ita mine in Arizona, we know produces rhenium, but doesn't report this in resources and reserves. We also know that Australian lead zinc deposits contain indium, but Australian zinc refineries don't produce this metal. If they send them overseas, we may get indium being produced, but otherwise it's just going to deport to waste. So the byproduct production is often dependent on where you ship or sell your concentrates. And understanding this and the implications of this is crucial for the production or future production of these critical metals. But if you want to put it simply, we often don't know how much we have, we don't know where it comes from, and we don't know how to increase production as a result. And all of these are going to be increasingly significant challenges going into the future. But as I say, these challenges are also opportunities, and I'll discuss some of the things that are going on in this area already in a few slides' time. One example of this is Broken Hill, a famous ore body in Australia, lead zinc ore body, where BHP got started. Here we have just an idea that the contained indium in tailings in tons from 1883 to the kind of last phase of mining at Broken Hill. If we think that 5% of the indium, conservatively 5% of the indium in the ore body reported to tailings, you're talking about 500 tons of indium in tailings just sitting on the ground there, waiting to be examined. If we're slightly more optimistic, we say 20%, that's 2,000 tons of indium. So that's what, 2.5 times current global indium production. And this is just one fairly large ore body, but it just shows the potential in waste materials that's just lying on the ground, waiting for somebody to come and have a look at it and come and re-examine it for metals that we simply didn't think were important when we originally started mining these things. We are getting better at identifying and producing some critical metals. You can look at ratios of byproducts to main products, like rhenium to molybdenum, indium to zinc. All of these are moving in favor of us producing more tons of indium or rhenium per ton of zinc production. So we're getting better at producing some of the critical metals. Tellurium to copper has decreased, and that's a function of maybe the way we process copper ores. If you, excuse me, if you extract copper by solvent extraction, electrowinning, basically you lose the tellurium into the heap leach pads and it'll never be recovered because of the dilution involved. There's economic decisions that control all of this, economic, geometallurgical decisions and so on, but not relating to the critical metals. And this is something that we might want to consider as an industry going forward, whether how can we enhance extraction of these things, especially as they're strategic for things like the US government and so on. And thinking about whether concentrators containing indium are sent to a zinc refinery that can produce indium depends on the zinc economics. It doesn't depend on the indium economics. And all of this shows the range of challenges we need to meet and need to undertake research in if we have a chance of meeting carbon dioxide targets and meeting this expanding demand we see for the technologies that use these commodities. But we can actually, it is possible to add value to projects by thinking about these critical metals. My postdoc and I have been working on tellurium. I've just got a few examples of data. So this is looking at the tellurium potential of precious and base metal operations globally. This is a small selection of mines, the companies involved, the products. What we've done is we generate proxies for contained tellurium and how much tellurium is produced per year by these operations based on available public data. So there may be assays, there may be mineralogy and so on. What we've got is we've got a tellurium proxy grade content in terms of how much each of these operations produces per year and the value add compared to the all-in sustaining costs. And some of these are fairly small, like at Bingham Canyon, you know, the all-in sustaining costs that could be removed or compensated for by tellurium production is about 0.5% of total operation. But the fact is Rio Tinto have decided to do this already and are moving this direction, as I'll discuss shortly. And our tellurium proxy for Bingham Canyon is fairly close to what Rio Tinto have reported. What we see here is a significant potential to positively affect value, but also the perception of operations. If you talk about tellurium and its use in solar panels, it's not just a potential value add to an operation, but it's also increasing the public awareness of the importance of mining, and specifically the importance of mining certain things from certain operations in terms of climate change mitigation and so on. There's one other thing that people often talk about when they talk about increased metal demand, it's recycling. You know, why can't we just recycle all the metals that we need? Why do we need to do mining now? We can recycle metals. It's a great idea, recycle a lot. We can't recycle all metals. The significant design, technological barriers to recycling of some metals. Recycling also can't meet increasing demand. A modern product design means that a lot of metals and waste materials simply are not designed for recycling. They're lost by design. They end up in landfills or in your drawers at home with those 3 mobile phones that you thought you might do something with once you got a new one, but actually they're just sitting around waiting for God knows what. We also know that metals and minerals can't be substituted for each other. And all of this means that what we're going to need to do is mine more. We can't just recycle things. We can't just think about, this is not it's part of the solution, but it is not the solution in a long way. If we look at this, this is a typical end of life recycling rates for the periodic table here. Anything in red is bad. Anything in red, we recycle less than 1% of. So all the lithium going into car batteries right now, that is recycled at a rate of less than 1%. In other words, it's often one use. That's changing somewhat, but we all know how dangerous these lithium batteries can be when, for example, you drop them or mishandle them. And imagine you've got an entire factory full of these things that you're trying to recycle. How do you actually get over the logistical and safety challenges of doing that to ensure we increase our recycling of that crucial commodity? Equally, lithium batteries from 10 years ago are different compositions of lithium batteries today. So that is another challenge that we're having to think about and having to deal with if we're trying to increase the recyclability of a range of these elements. We are good at recycling, say, the base metals. Some of the precious metals, certainly we have recycling rates greater than 50%, but there's a lot of this periodic table that we just don't recycle. And that means that what we're going to have to do is meet increased demand by mining more, essentially, making more of what we already know we have. There's a lot of potential for recycling. So this is a paper in 2015 looking at what's potentially recyclable, what's currently recycled but could be recycled, what's in use and dissipated and will never be lost, and what we don't know about. There's a lot of potential recycling of some of these elements, but also there's other elements that are at the moment currently unrecyclable or just will never be recyclable because of the way we use them. So again, recycling is certainly good. It can improve, it can meet some demand, but there's a huge range of challenges to increase this recycling. And in some elements, we can't recycle because of the way we use them. And there's a few challenges for you all to think about. It doesn't stop there. We need to find more mineral deposits. It's not easy discovering, especially world-class mineralization. We need to make the most of these deposits. It's not easy. We need to deal with waste rock and tailings effectively, store them securely. Investors are thinking about this, increasingly thinking about this and thinking about removing their money from operations that don't store these things safely. And equally, there's opportunities there. Things like if you mine nickel from an ultramafic intrusion, that you put the tailings material out and expose it to where it can actually naturally sequester carbon dioxide. It's been measured at a number of the Kamatia operations in Western Australia. It's also things like environmental, social, and governmental challenges to mining, ensuring mining is sustainable. And there's two other groups that need to be thought about. These are NIMBYs and bananas. NIMBYs are not in my backyard. So in other words, this is great, build some solar panels, but don't build them anywhere near me. And bananas are people who say, well, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. We don't need to build anything ever again. We've got all we ever need to build. So why do we need to build more? These groups of people, you need to actually explain to them, you can't have solar power, you can't have Tesla vehicles without raw materials. You need to have some acceptance that mining is required. Metals need to be smelted, refined, etc. And equally, you can't just ship it to other countries for processing, then you get manufactured products back. Why? Security of supply is an issue with that geopolitically. Equally, it's a huge value loss. You know, if you actually let the processing and the real value add within the mining chain occur somewhere else, then you actually lose out on that value and another country benefits. It's not just mining of metals and minerals. Concrete and cement are huge carbon dioxide producers. We don't have a solution for that. Metallurgical coal is still needed as well for blast furnaces and so on. But people globally are just saying, well, we don't need to mine any more coal anywhere. So there's all sorts of arguments and nuances and explanations we need to have to actually explain to people how important mining is, not just of metals, but also minerals and things like aggregates and coal, still going to be important going into the future. We know that most critical metals and minerals are never going to be significant enough for major mining companies to target. There's some exceptions, but there's a low probability of this transformational change. We're going to need some policy making to deal with this. We need to do, I have a paper that I presented to the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation on the policies developed in this area that I'm happy to share with anybody. But you know, we need to think about what policies we need to make to actually think about how we can meet this demand that's going to be occurring very shortly, or is it occurring already. We have some developments with geopolitically friendly countries like Canada to the north and Australia, so aiming to secure supplies of critical metals and minerals. But you know, there's no reason why we can't actually enhance domestic production of these things as well. That's something we should be thinking about, and something policymakers should be thinking about as well. There's significant potential for domestic exploration and mine development, but compared to other countries and regions, some parts of the US are way behind in pre-competitive data, streamlining of processes, permitting, and so on. This is, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Fraser Institute survey. This is in 2020. Outlining perceptual and mineral endowments and public policy factors like taxation, regulation, affect exploration investment. I'm not showing it because Nevada's top, but certainly Nevada, Arizona, Alaska, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, all of these jurisdictions in the US are doing pretty well in terms of global perception of how friendly they are for mining. But there's a lot of other places within the US that are shown here, which are a lot further down the graph, but actually have significant mineral potential. And this is something that that individual states need to think about, something that maybe the federal government should act to encourage mineral exploration in some of these states with lower values in this Fraser Institute survey. But kind of just to start wrapping up, the bottom line is if you want to do anything about climate change, you're going to need to mine more minerals and metals. Creates lots of questions and problems, but also opportunities. Where we're going to find these metals and minerals, you know, we need to understand the processes that form mineral deposits and control the concentration of critical metals in these deposits. We need to increase efficiency and efficacy of mining in terms of recovery and energy use. We need to think about mining secondary deposits, landfills, mining waste, and so on. We need to think about how long all this will take compared to the steep rises in demand we're expecting. How long will exploration, discovery, and permitting all take until we can get these mines coming on stream to meet this increased demand? Environmental, social, governmental challenges, benefits, risks all need to be considered, and they're all becoming increasingly important. All you need to do is look at the likes of Rio Tinto and Yukon Gorge and to realize that, you know, the real negative impact one bad story can have on a company. So what we need is education, research, and discussion on all sides, and beyond just geoscience, beyond the industry. We need to speak to the general public. One comparison I often make is the difference between farming and mining. Both are vital to modern society, but people think of a mine, they think of an environmentally problematic hole in the ground that just causes a whole lot of negative things and creates no positive stuff whatsoever. This is the general public's perception. If the general public thinks about farming, they think about kind of nice bucolic green fields, gently lowing cows and all these things that aren't actually really true. They ignore the fact that farming is environmentally problematic as well, and environmentally and socially problematic in many ways. So it's just we need to engage better with the general public. We need to actually demonstrate and talk to them about why mining is important, and especially so as it's going to become increasingly more important in their lives in the not too distant future. We need to understand the problems that we face. We need to educate people about the importance of our industry. We're doing some of this at UNLV. I have to have a plug in there every so often, but we just need to actually kind of talk about this in a more broad sense. You all know that every single person listening to this talk needs mining. We need, the devices we need for work and entertainment, the electricity we use, cars we drive, houses, all of these require minerals and metals. That demand for minerals and metals is going to increase because if we want to reduce anthropogenic climate change and we want to lower carbon dioxide emissions, we're going to have to mine more, and that's something that everybody, the general public especially, is going to have to come to terms with. There's no point having electric vehicles fueled by electricity generated by coal. There wouldn't be any point in doing that transition whatsoever. It would be worse than having a gas guzzling SUV. And if your immediate attitude is climate change doesn't exist, the world's moving this way anyway. This is the chance of the US, Nevada, Colorado to be world leaders. Demand for these metals increase. Does the US want to be the world supplier of raw materials or home of some of the high-tech manufacturing that's currently in China? Australia is facing this very question. At the moment, they sell the materials they mine rather than processing in Australia, and that means they're losing out on a lot of the value add. So this is just a few things to wrap up with. Thinking about value add along the mining chain, from mining through processing, manufacturing. These are diamonds, but this is equally applicable to the rare earth elements, to whatever commodity you want to look at. These are the value add from exploration and production through to production of rough diamonds or concentrates in the terms of metals. And then we get the manufacturing and incorporation into end user goods. And this is where the real value add is. And all of this, if you're looking at Australia, they mine the stuff and they export it, and all this value add, which is far more significant than this end, actually occurs somewhere else. Similarly, again, Australia, they're mining rare earths at Mount Weld, one of the highest grade rare earth element deposits in the world. The ores are processed offshore, and then they end up in manufactured goods offshore. So all the value add with those rare earths is actually, all this value add in the diamond chain is down here, is again occurring offshore again. So we need to think about where we process mineralization, where we process ores, as well as where we mine them. We're already seeing some changes. Australia is thinking about roadmaps for processing critical minerals domestically. Huge challenges, but they certainly think about it. This is an example. Bingham Canyon is mining tellurium. They're going to produce about 20 tons of tellurium a year, which is maybe 5% of global tellurium production, 4-5%. The plant they're putting in, I think, cost them $3 million. The value of that tellurium will pay for that infrastructure in 2 or 3 years. So there's actually value in here. It's nowhere near as valuable as the copper and molybdenum produced at Bingham, but certainly in terms of positive publicity, in terms of sustainability reporting, and in terms of actually making some money for a minimal investment outlay. There's actually quite a lot of things to be considered, positives to be considered in terms of critical metal production and so on. Rio Tinto, again, a couple of other examples here. They're starting to make lithium in California from mining waste, from the boron operations. Again, borates, boron, they're thinking about extracting scandium from titanium dioxide processes. But there are some challenges. Lithium exploration at Thacker Pass, is running into a number of problems here in Nevada that you might have heard of as well. And it's not easy being green. You might have heard of Jadar in Serbia, Rio Tinto's kind of flagship lithium project. What we have here is that, this is June 7th, 2021, Serbia deciding the fate of Rio Tinto in a referendum. January 20, Serbia revokes the exploration project, the exploration licenses for Jadar, basically saying the project's dead. Some of this may have been local, but also there's other groups here like an NGO, which is basically the London Mining Network, actually getting involved in things like actually trying to get Rio Tinto to basically leave the area. So again, these are the environmental, social, and governmental challenges the minerals industry faces. They're not going away; they're going to increase. But one way of actually mitigating these might be to effectively talk about how the metals you're producing are going to enable things like climate change mitigation and so on. There's, it's not always the answer. Certainly, it isn't the answer in Jadar's case, but it's something that we need to talk about more. We need to explain more and promote more as an industry, I would say. And there's also like red tape versus green minerals. This is Western Maine, talking again about lithium. There's essentially pegmatites in Maine, which have significant lithium potential, but state regulations in Maine passed in 2017 prohibit mining for metals in open pits of more than 3 acres. There's things like right level of regulation, again, talking about spodumene in Maine over here. So there's debates going on in a number of states with critical mineral potential, but what those outcomes of those debates are going to be is still uncertain. Whether we can actually reverse some of this legislation that prevents mining in Maine and enables the extraction of lithium and the like is something that we'll have to see what happens in the future. The other key thing here is policymakers. We talk about kind of New Mexico, we might have brownouts as a result of solar projects not being finished because basically the raw materials needed are not being supplied. Global lithium shortage could put brakes on UK electric car sales acceleration. Half US cars to be zero emission by 2030. All of this, this is great. This is certainly again backing up what we've seen in consumer and investor sentiment. But the fact is that policymakers need to understand the costs or the reality of the targets they're stating in terms of raw material supply, demand, so on. Where these materials are going to come from, where's this lithium going to come from, where these rare earths going to come from to meet these changes that policymakers are saying are going to happen, and consumers and changes that consumers want. So the question is kind of what now? We need more conversations, discussions of this rather than just saying we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. That's certainly something that people say a lot, but if they don't think about the actuality of that, what it means in terms of raw material mining and demand, then you're not even halfway there. We need more research, education, outreach, consideration of all of these things during policy development. We need more open conversation from all sides about this rather than ignoring it. The public needs to know the cost of being green and the role of mining in that. You can talk about all you want, how you need to combat climate change, make policy to achieve that. If you don't understand and accept the mineral and metal cost of this, you're only halfway there. That's my 2 cents on that. And that's it. That's all I have for this presentation. There's a lot more material I could have talked about, but I wanted to keep sort of time. If anybody does have any questions, I can always answer them now. You can always email me at the email address there. I'm sure Corey and others will be happy to pass that on. I can pass on papers. I can pass on this PowerPoint. Happy to continue this discussion. And as I say, if anybody wants any more on the material I shared, just let me know and I'm happy to pass that on.